I'm Michelle. I'm the manager of the Impossible NYC space. Just doing a really quick just introduction and description of the space before we get to the main event. So basically, the Impossible Project is producing new film for vintage Polaroid cameras. So right now we are selling, we sell vintage refurbished cameras. We also sell film for the 600 SX70 Spectra, and we also sell 8x10 film. We've been around for about 3.5 years, and we've been putting out different generations of film, each one better than the next. The space itself is a combination, our U.S. home office, a camera refurbishing department, as well as a gallery space. We have a new exhibition that goes up approximately every 5 weeks. We do a lot of workshops. We shoot 8x10 portraits. We do a lot of free events as far as photo walks and various other things in the space. We are open 7 days a week, and there's a lot of really amazing stuff that's going on, and you should definitely check us out. We've got an upcoming calendar of events we have in the next 3 months, various different exhibitions and workshops and other things. But I will, give the floor to Chris, and if anyone has any questions, I will be over there after the event, and I will be more than happy to answer them.
How you doing? My name is Ephraim Epstein. I'm Hopkins class of 1990, and I'm also a member of the AEME Affinity group. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. I hope you're all excited about this event. I definitely am excited about this event. I don't remember the exact first moment I met Chris, but I know it must have been early on freshman year. We were classmates. We started together in the fall of '86. Just to give you an idea of how long ago that was. I know Chris is going to talk tonight about Polaroid and basically how the company was affected as technology changed, how technology ushered it in, and basically how technology changed the company. Something along those lines. To give you an idea how long fall of '86 was, I remember Chris lived in Lazier, I lived in Jennings, and many people in Jennings and Lazier hung out in the same room. Why did they hang out in this person's room? Because this person actually had a CD player in the dorm. And that was considered cutting edge technology back then. And just to give you how long ago that was. Very excited about this event. Chris is a senior editor at New York Magazine. He's the author of Instant, as you'll hear about tonight. He writes and edits culture and technology stories. He's also written for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and Slate. And he maintains his own blog, PolaroidLand.net. He lives right here in New York City with his wife, their son, and his son appears in many, many instant photos. Without any further ado, Chris Philbin.
Thank you all. Thanks for coming. Thank you to Ephraim and Elena and Brina and Michelle and to whoever fixed the elevator this morning. Little excitement just before you got here. Well, I thought I would start by addressing the most basic question some of you probably have, which is why should I care about Polaroid? It is a company that, while not dead, is very much diminished. The product on which its fortunes were built, which is analog instant photography, was a mass medium, and now it is a small niche. Everyone here probably owns a digital camera. Most of you have one in your pocket on your phone, and it does remarkable things. You can send a picture around the world in a second. If you own a Polaroid camera, well, it's a funny thing to say in this room, because there may be some enthusiasts. If you own a Polaroid camera, chances are it's in the closet and you don't use it much. I carry one every day, by the way, but that's me. Polaroid itself stopped making film in 2008. And although certain other companies have picked up the torch, and others are still in the game as well, nobody's going around saying this is the giant future of photography, exactly. In the 1970s, they were. And in fact, in those years, at its peak, there were 1 billion Polaroid photographs made every year. And now as a form, it's mostly gone. After all, digital pictures are instant pictures. The chief advance of Polaroid photography was that you saw what you had done on the spot and in the moment. If your photo was poorly made, or overexposed, or badly framed, you could take it again before that moment evaporated. With the digital photograph, you can do that, and you can do it essentially for free. You're not paying by the picture the way you were in the old days. It's especially valuable when you are learning to take pictures. You know, anybody who's old enough to have learned back in the analog days remembers the incredibly frustrating experience of shooting a roll of film, sending it off, getting it back days later at significant expense, and it was nothing, blank or awful or too dark or too light, and you had no idea what you'd done wrong. You couldn't remember how you'd misset the camera. You had no feedback. With digital photography, all of that has disappeared. I always say that very young people learning now, I mean, 7-year-olds who are shooting for the first time, they can do what used to take us 10 years of learning in about a month. You shoot your first 10,000 pictures in a few days. It's fantastic as a learning tool. Somehow, though, digital pictures do not work on you in the same sort of mysterious way that Polaroid pictures do. You know, if you take one of these cameras, as I do, to a party, and you pull it out, something happens to people. First of all, they're very curious about it because, I mean, who carries that around? Obviously. But then, you know, people respond to it. They want to know if film's still available, and then you hand a picture to somebody that you've just taken of them, and it takes a moment to come together. You know, it takes about a minute to develop, sometimes longer with certain films. And there's that moment in which you have to talk and make small talk, sometimes about the picture, sometimes about what appears in the picture once it comes out. It is a very social way of taking pictures. And that doesn't quite happen the same way with digital photography, because bang, it's there and you email it, and then you see it when you get home, or you see it on your phone. But you don't have the exchange in the same way. You know, when you're done with the process, you give that photo to somebody as a gift. Moreover, that is especially powerful with little kids. I carry this, as I said, every day, and we have a 4-year-old at home. And so I often take him to the playground to take pictures of him. I cannot tell you how many times I've been taking pictures of him. A little friend he's made runs up. I will take a picture of that kid and hand it to the parent as the souvenir of the moment, or just because it's a cute picture of the kid or whatever. I can't tell you how many people have come into our lives this way and become friends, lingering, lasting friends, because of this kind of social photograph moment. The object that is a Polaroid photograph, when you give it as a gift, feels a little precious, in part because it's the only one. There's no negative. You can't copy this so easily without kind of going through a process that is a little bit of a rigor. You know, you have to take it home, put it on a scanner or whatever. In the moment, if you give it to somebody, they have the only one. It's like you gave them a little artwork, or you know, it's more like a painting in some ways, an edition of one, as an upgrade once put it. Polaroid, in its prime, was an organization that really believed in the social power of photography, and especially instant photography. They were very aware of that. In fact, it was not a company that was about photography per se. They believed in inventing things and enhancing communication and reaching out to people across divides. They ran almost as an idea factory, thinking big like that, and only incidentally in some ways made cameras and film. And those ideas would periodically kick out an invention, like instant photography, like some other things they made, that would be worth, you know, a few $1 billion. They used to have a slogan in their day for one of the cameras that was popular in the 1960s. The jingle was, "It's more than a camera, it's almost alive." Actually, it was a budget-priced camera, and the next line is a lot more prosaic, because it's more than a camera, it's almost alive, it's only $19.95. Its successors, in many ways, are not Nikon and Samsung, but companies like Google and Apple that kind of reinvent the form of reinvent technologies and sort of bend your life in fresh ways that you didn't expect. You need louder? I'll do my best. My voice really doesn't carry, but I'll do my best. Really what they tried to do with every new product introduction, starting in the 1940s, was come up with something you had never seen before that was going to enhance your life, and place it in front of you without market research, and say, take a look, you're going to love this. This all may remind you of something. It is very much the spirit of Apple today. And I bring up Apple deliberately because, and I am not the first to point this out, the two companies have one particular thing in common. They were both built on the spot where technology and art intersect, the liberal arts intersect. They both were obsessed with fine design. You know, Polaroid cameras were intricate and beautiful objects, much in the same way that iPhones and iPads are. And the cultures of the companies really demanded design be as much a priority as technology was. And you know, they demanded that a camera be something that was pleasing to the eye, and pleasing, and sort of demanded that you pick it up, a nice little object like that. I should explain this. Which delights everyone in my seat. Most of all, though, both companies had a figure at their head who was a unique soul. At Apple, you all know that was Steve Jobs. At Polaroid, there was a man by the name of Edwin Herbert Land. There he is. Just as Apple stories always seem to lead back to Steve, Polaroid stories all go back to Edwin Land. He was, in his time, as public a figure as Steve Jobs was in ours. When the SX70, this camera, appeared in the early 70s, he, in the course of just a couple of months, appeared on the cover of Life magazine and the cover of Time magazine, about 4 months apart. At shareholders' meetings of Polaroid, you know, at the time, a shareholders' meeting was a guy with a spreadsheet reading the balance sheet. Starting in the 60s, Land said, we're going to do something different. He would hire a string quartet, and he would have performers on stage, and there would be people taking pictures all around, and he would, and the crescendo of the day would sort of build, and he would take the stage with something in his hand, whether it was this or some other product that was being introduced, and he would not just show it to you, but explain it to you, explain why it was important, explain why it mattered, and why you would love it. And by the end of that meeting, you had to have one. And in the 1970s, a young Steve Jobs was watching this. And if you've ever seen a product introduction tape from Apple, you know, the big dog and pony show that they do on stage, he's doing the same thing. And in fact, that is Edwin Land in 1972. And what I love is that they have the same tape. They were, like I said, Steve was paying attention. He was explicit about it, too. He idolized Edwin Land. He made a pilgrimage to Cambridge, Massachusetts, where Polaroid had been headquartered, to meet him in his old age. He explicitly said that the Polaroid model, where art meets technology, is where he wanted Apple to be. He was open about his admiration. Land, late in his career, was sort of pushed into retirement, and Jobs, in an interview the next year, said, he was talking about the Polaroid board, he said, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. He thought, he once said, the man is a national treasure. He said, I don't know why kids want to aspire to be a sports star or a movie star or something. They should aspire to be this. I mean, he was quite aware of the parallels. The interesting thing about Polaroid is that it started out having nothing to do with photography at all. The initial product on which its fortunes were built was something completely different. A material that they called Polaroid. It is essentially a filter that polarizes light. It's a little difficult to explain without diagrams, but I'll do my best. A polarizing filter is chemically treated so that light passing through it is filtered into one dimension. The classic example is this. A beam of light coming at you is like a bundle of thrown straws. The light rays are in every possible direction. A polarizing filter is like a cone. So all the ones that come through are aligned afterward. Now what that means is that you can take two and align them, and the light will keep going through. Misalign them, and the light will be blocked. And so if you put two polarizing filters over each other, you created a valve that is finely controllable for light. This sounds arcane, I realize, but it is not. It has many, many applications. For one thing, it is very useful in things like sunglasses. If you've ever had polarizing sunglasses, you set them at a certain angle, and reflected light, which is polarized, and reflected glaring light off a lake or a street, which is polarized, will be blocked. If you have this business going on in a pair of goggles, it's very useful to, for example, pilots. And in fact, many, many of these products were made during the Second World War. It's useful in gun sights. It's useful in industrial applications. There are 100 other things. And even today, the chief use is in a screen like the one on your phone or your tablet or your flat screen computer monitor. There is one sheet of polarizing filter in there, and then each little cell in the grid is chemically able to polarize light, and it essentially twists. Those liquid crystals are polarizing crystals in your liquid crystal display. Each one turns, on, off, red, green, blue, red, green, blue, red, green, blue. Do it times 10,000, and you've got an image. It has a major application to this day. If you peel apart your cheapo computer monitor, you can get a sheet of polarizer out of there if you were so inclined. As I said, this was the product on which Polaroid's fortunes were built, especially during the Second World War because of all those industrial applications and military applications. Every pilot who went off to war in Europe was wearing Polaroid goggles in his plane. The company grew and grew and grew. It went from 40 employees in the late 30s to 1,200 toward the end of the war, and was doing extremely well with an understanding that all of that would come to an end. And around the end of 1943, there was sort of a general understanding. I mean, the war was by no means over, but there was a general understanding that the United States was going to win, probably, and that that the war material business would be going away. Land was very concerned about seeing his company shrink away to nothing again. He knew they had to get into another business. And in late 1943, he had an idea. This is the great founding myth of instant photography. And it is probably true. December 1943, Land went on vacation briefly to the Southwest, to Santa Fe, with his wife and his daughter, who was 3. He was out taking pictures of her with his little Rolleiflex camera. His daughter, her name was Jennifer, looked up at him at the end of the day and said, "Why can't I see the pictures now?" And Land, who was a chemist and a physicist and knew a lot about optics from the polarizer business, essentially said, well, and began to think. All of his colleagues talked before and after that about his ability to invent on demand. And everything he had learned in the polarizer business, as I said, about optics, about thin plastic films, about the chemistry of making polarizing material, everything sort of started to click and fire together. The story goes that he sent Jennifer off to be with her mother for a while, and he spent his nights walking around the resort in Santa Fe, working it out. He claimed that in about 3 hours, he sort of had it. What he always joked was that I worked it all out in a few hours, except for the details that took from 1943 to 1972 to solve. And by crazy coincidence, also in another hotel in Santa Fe, you can't make this up, was his patent lawyer, also on vacation. And he went over to the guy's hotel room and studied dictating. Back in Boston, a couple of weeks later, they started work. He deputized a small team in a lab with a locked door. I should explain that during the polarizer days, Polaroid had gotten involved in a number of intellectual property fights, lawsuits, people who had similar inventions. There was a lot of tussling over that, and Land had learned very specifically about the power of the patent. And so they started writing everything down. And if you go through the Polaroid files, which are now at Harvard Business School in the archives, there is a disclosure from those days in December 1943 for the next 4 years. There is a disclosure almost every day from a scientist or an associate of Land's explaining exactly what he did that day, explaining what Land had said to him in great detail. Mr. Land disclosed to me the possibility of a thin film that would do this, a SACA developer that would do that, a development mechanism involving 2 rollers and a spreader. Over and over and over, they're almost all coming from his brain, and they are all written down in exquisite detail, witnessed and signed by 2 people from the staff. Everything was fantastically detailed on paper for reasons of intellectual property. I will tell you that when you're writing a book about this, it's fantastic. I meant to say, during the war, the goggles that were available, this is a particularly strange pair of sunglasses that was available at the time. See that little switch at the top? You flick it back and forth to move 2 polarizers over one another. You can lighten and darken your sunglasses at will. They're extremely dorky and fantastic.
So steampunk.
Hey, they are totally steampunk, especially with the side picks, right? There's a pair of pilot's goggles that are even more so because they're goggles. They have the rubber fitting against your head. 4 years of development followed. And in 1947, Land had everything far enough along that it was to be revealed to the world. It happened in New York at a meeting of the American Optical Society, and it was the Hotel Pennsylvania, still here, at 33rd and 7th Avenue, across from Penn Station. He was supposed to give a little demo, and the night before there was a huge blizzard. They almost didn't make it from Boston, but they did. And here's what he did. They had a very large 8x10 camera. I don't know if you saw it. It was in the back of the room, I think. The big wooden kind with the brass lens that sticks out the front. It looks like something from the 19th century. The kind with the black cloth over the head. But it had been rigged with a special back to hold experimental instant film. And then there was a rig on the table next to it to process it. There's a product a little like it that is still used for large format instant film. They set up on a table, a little like this. Land had a cable release and stepped around, took his own picture. One of his assistants took the film out of the back of the camera, put it in the rig, and they passed it through 2 rollers. That's how the early instant film worked. Put it through 2 rollers, broke a little sack of developer, and smeared it across between the negative film and the positive on which the print would appear. You let it develop for about 60 seconds, you peel the 2 apart, you've got your picture, you throw away the negative. Land did this in front of a room full of physicists and scientists and also reporters. And this was the most important thing because this was the media unveiling. And he was tense. Because when you have something that appears a little gimmicky like this, you only get one try. And if you're going to do it in front of a room full of reporters who are somewhat jaded people, you have to get it right. He took the picture, ran it through the thing, steeled himself, peeled it open, and that's it. That is at that meeting. This is actually the moment when it was revealed to the world. This photo ran in Life magazine the following week. And I will tell you, I am struck by 2 things about this picture. One is that because it was a large format camera, his head is about the size of his head. And it is extremely compelling. It makes you look. And you see the same collar and the same, when you pull it down further, it's the same tie, and it's 60 seconds earlier. And the second thing is, look at the relief in his face because it worked. They tested it 100 times, but you can it's like the Olympics. You can practice 1,000 times, and if you screw it up in front of the judges, it's all over. The story goes that they revealed the first one, and the New York Times reporter who was in the back of the room and half paying attention saw that, came tearing up the aisle, and said to Land, "Do it again." And he did. And in fact, they took all the reporters' pictures that night and gave them out as souvenirs to take back to the paper and print, which was very wise. I will say in the New York Times the next day, there were not 1 but 2 stories. There was a news story, pretty far up front in the paper too, that includes the there was a news story up front, and then there was an editorial inside also, which contained the sentence, "There is nothing like this in the history of As I said, this was a full page of Life magazine the next week. The thing about Life magazine, it was a picture magazine. They knew what a big deal this was because they were photo editors. They were used to, we got it back, okay, send it to the lab, show me in 3 hours when it's dry, And here, 60 seconds, bam, on a news cycle. It was the most fantastic thing they'd ever seen, It was, needless to say, a sensation. We got a huge amount of press for this. The camera came on the market the next year. It took them a year to get it into production, but it appeared just in time for Christmas 1948. That is the original Model 95 camera. Here it is in person. I don't always have it, so I have the picture, but it's here. It's a monster. You can see. It weighs 4 pounds of change. And although it's a beautiful object, it's a beast. It works through somewhat complicated means. You focus by moving it in and out like that. You fire your shutter like that. And then what you do is throw a switch on the back. Open this, pull a paper tab, tear it off, throw it away. Wait 60 seconds, open the back, peel your photo out. It's that big. And in the early iterations of the film, it was not even black and white, it was brown and white. It was sepia. It was a somewhat primitive product, and it was fantastic. It was a sensation. The camera went on sale on what we now call Black Friday, 1948, November 26th. We just passed the 65th anniversary last week. At Jordan Marsh department store in Boston, which was there at Macy's. The factory had just barely got going. They sent over fewer than 60 cameras, 50-something cameras. And they said, well, that'll hold until Christmas. You know how these stories go. They sold them all and they got theirs. They also sold the demonstrator camera. They also sold the dummy demonstrator camera that didn't work by mistake. They sold all the film they had taken over. There's a picture of the salesman standing on the counters because the crowds are crushing them so that they had to get up out of them. It was a sensation, a phenomenon, in the same way that every great consumer product has that really caught the public's eye, takes off. That continued really for years to come. Through the 1950s, you look at Polaroid stock price, it goes up 30% a year. Production just zooms. They keep expanding the line. They made a camera smaller than this pretty soon because nobody who wasn't a big hulking dude was going to carry this around. So they made a smaller version of it this big and marketed it to women. They had other full line. They had professional cameras with good lenses. They had all sorts of stuff coming. In the 1960s, you had this line, which is generally produced a Paxton camera. This was smaller and lighter. Used the same peel-apart film, but a much simpler process. You could shoot. You didn't have to wait 60 seconds for one to develop before you pulled it out of the back of the camera. It would. Well, I'll show you. Yeah, yeah.
I photographed Soho.
What you did there, that's your picture. I'll show it to you in a minute. Literally in a minute. And in the meantime, you can look at Nick. That's also the first time color film was available, 1963. And that was a fantastic project to come around. Land had deputized a guy named Howard Rogers in his lab to come up with a way of translating their black and white technology to color at the very beginning, back in the 40s. Land said, just watch everything and figure it out. And Rogers did nothing except watch for 2 years. And in 1950, came to Land and said, I'm ready to begin. And it was 13 years beyond that before it came to market. Land was very proud of this. He once said, my point is that we had the kind of environment where you could pay a man to sit and think for 2 years. Where a man was expected to sit and think for 2 years, and he said expected, not even asked. Company kept growing. Inexpensive cameras in the mid-60s. As I said, pack film came along. Color was a huge sensation. But Land was still unsatisfied. You saw what I just did. It took 2 pulls. You end up with trash until this is peeled apart. In a minute, you'll see there's more trash. I had to focus that camera by moving bellows in and out. Land had had a vision, starting in the 1940s, of what he called one-step photography. You point, you click, and then you have your picture. You shouldn't have to do all that stuff to get your picture, was his vision. And starting in the mid-60s, he really started pushing his scientists to come up with something that got it over that hill. It arrived in 1972, and it's a system called the SX70. That's this little guy that I showed you before. And it comes very close to the idea. It is a single lens reflex camera, which if you're a photographer means something, otherwise maybe not. But what it amounts to is that you're looking through, when you look through the eyepiece, you're looking through the lens. So you see exactly what that sheet of film is going to see. Moreover, apart from a manual focus on this, which they eliminated a few years later with some automatic systems, all you did, point, there's an electric eye, it sets its own exposure, it sets its own aperture. You point, you click, picture comes out, it develops before your eyes. It was a fantastic piece of technology in 1972. And as I said, it made the cover of Time, and it made the cover of Warhol. You sort of can't understand its impact now if you grew up in the digital world. But again, the thought of a picture that reveals itself out in the light is, when you start thinking about it, extraordinary. Every other picture you took in the film era had to be produced in the dark. They were old film, it was sealed up in an old canister, you popped it open in a dark room, and developed in an old tank. Here was this thing that, when it was inside the camera, the light coming through the lens exposed it. So it was light sensitive. Popped out into the light, a second later, it was light-proof and could develop underneath. How do you do that? Well, the answer is a chemical called the opacifier, and it was easily 3 years in development. No pun intended. It was a chemical that would be light-proof, completely light-proof, for 3 to 4 minutes, and then vanish. That was a fantastic invention, one of the many fantastic inventions of Land's Labs in those days, and there's still nothing quite like it apart from what these guys are doing. As I said, this camera was a sensation, and it was embraced by, needless to say, every family that could afford one in the 70s, but also all sorts of fine artists began to adopt it for different reasons. Walker Evans, in the early 70s, was elderly and frail, and he had spent his whole life using a big view camera, the kind I was talking about before. He couldn't do it anymore. He had retired. He had stopped taking pictures. Walker Evans had stopped taking pictures. Somebody gave him one of these as a gift. And he said, I set it as a challenge to myself. Let's see if we can make this thing do. And there is a whole second body of work in these little frames. You can go up to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and see some of it on view at any time. They really need to put up another show of the whole series, because there are hundreds upon hundreds of them. And they're beautiful. They're pictures of Americana. They look like the familiar Walker Evans pictures from the 1930s, except they're in color and they're little Polaroid squares. It's remarkable. They're splendid. Andy Warhol absolutely loved this form because, he was nothing if not a guy who wanted to go to a party. And as I said, a party camera is, oh yeah, somebody else liked it too. Capitalism. Andy really, really loved it. He had earlier used one of these pack film cameras, a different one, called the Polaroid Big Shot, which shot just portraits. But he was gradually persuaded to go over to the SX70 because it was so easy to do, and they kept giving him a lot of film. But he embraced it as a medium, and in fact, if you go to the Warhol Museum, those little boxes he used to toss objects into all day long and seal up. There are thousands upon thousands upon thousands of Polaroid pictures, just of ridiculous things. There'll be a picture of, I don't know, a spoon or something he ate for lunch, or Bianca Jagger. It's anything in his life. They're sort of sprinkled around. Robert Mapplethorpe loved Polaroid for an entirely different reason. His photographs were extremely sexually explicit. And you couldn't really send those pictures to the lab in 1970 because you would probably get hauled into jail. He didn't have to worry about that. These pictures were developed in his bedroom. And in fact, he was not the only one to figure that out. There is a whole other body of Polaroid work which doesn't get shown in museums, but gave people a lot of fun in the 1960s and 70s. I will also say that it's one of the first things people figured out. You know, when I was researching the book, I checked with somebody there are pornography scholars, believe it or not, and I interviewed one of them, and he told me, oh yeah, the Kinsey Institute, this stuff's from, you know, the camera was a year old when they had big color pictures taken with this new technology that allows all sorts of special fun. But if there was anyone who really embraced Polaroid as a fine art, it was Ansel Adams. And that may surprise people because you think of him as a maker of pristine images, and you think of Polaroid as a sort of amateur medium, you know. But he was also a great technician. And Adams was excited by anything that allowed new horizons of photography, technological speed. In 1949, he was at a conference, photography conference, and he met Edwin Land. And the two got to talking. Land ended up taking his picture with prototype film. Adams later said, you know, we went over to the studio and took my picture. It was kind of brown. It was really awful quality. But I got really excited. I said, this is something. And Land ended the evening saying, well, come and be our consultant. And I'll pay you $100 a month. Adams stayed in that role until his death, 35 years later, getting considerably more than $100 a month. A lot of people would have just taken the money and said, well, you know, I'm lending my name, whatever, I'm the celebrity spokesmodel for this. Not him. He got involved. He would test every new Polaroid product. When they introduced a new film with a different tonal range, black and white, let's say, they would pack up a case of it and a camera and send it out to Ansel in California, and they would get back typewritten sheets with 4 pictures stapled and notes on f-stop, aperture, length of development time, sun, everything in his crabbed little handwriting. Dozens of them. Notes on what worked, what didn't. Very often they are familiar Adams landscapes of Half Moon or of Half Dome or of other images in Yosemite National Park, but with a grayscale card propped in the front so the technicians could see exactly what he was dealing with. They are a fantastic document, and as I said, he did it for 35 years. It's quite striking. This stuff is up at Harvard too, and seriously, they should make their own book of it because it's illuminating to see the man at work. It was an enthusiasm that sustained him for many, many years. He even persuaded Land to create certain kinds of film that would be better for the professional photographer, larger formats and so forth. So there was this other camera which is worth mentioning. It was an experimental thing that Polaroid built. What you see here is obviously Andy Warhol with a picture of himself that is 90 seconds old. The camera behind him is the camera that took this picture. And it is essentially a version of this that's 5 feet high. It's called the 20 by 24 camera because that's how many, the pictures are 20 by 24 inches. This camera, believe it or not, is still active and working here in New York City. I have taken a picture of it. It's the craziest thing you've ever seen. It was meant to show off the quality of Polaroid instant film. The thing I particularly love here is he's got one of these cameras tucked under his arm. So it's a Polaroid of a Polaroid of a Polaroid of a Polaroid. It's the same process I just showed you, except that the rollers are back here in the camera, and you pull them out like that, and then you peel it like that, and it's the size of your coffee table when it's done. It is the craziest thing you've ever seen. And they still shoot portraits with it. It's up at Lincoln Center. I think they shot Oprah last week. So this all sounds great, and you may be wondering how such a forward-thinking company went down the tubes. And there is no villain. There's no one colossal screw-up. There's no Ansel in this story per se. there are many sort of stumbling missteps going down the hill. One is a product called Polavision that came along in the late 70s. It was a land pet project. It was 8 millimeter. Oh, excuse me. That's to show you that was Ansel Adams together with Land's successor. It was called Polavision. It was an 8 millimeter movie camera, and it was instant developing movie film, which sounds fantastic, and from a technological standpoint was fantastic. You shot your movie. You took out your little cartridge of film. You stuck it in a player, which looked like a TV set. As it rewound, 90 seconds, your reel of film developed, and you could show it right away. It sounds awesome. Technologically, it was among the most complex and beautiful things Polaroid ever made. And in the marketplace, it bombed. For many reasons, mostly because you didn't have that sharing moment. You couldn't give it to somebody. You were tethered to this player. And also because it had taken 16 years to get it to market. And by the time it came along, there was something called video. Land had shoved it through because he was besotted with the technology. He could not face that the world was beginning to move away from purely analog media to things like magnetic tape and what would, in the long term, be the digital world. It's the very beginning, I would say, the failure of television, of the analog-digital wars that we are still seeing play out at their tail end. Another thing that dominated the company in the late 70s was a fight, because Polaroid had been so successful in the 60s that the industry giant, 10 times its size, Eastman Kodak, said, perhaps we have been ignoring this at our peril. In 1976, Kodak introduced a line of cameras directly aimed at the SX70. It too spit the photo out the front. It had a white tab at the bottom. It developed before your eyes. It had a slightly different system in that it's a lot of technical detail, but it exposed to the back instead of the front, and there were other sort of small adjustments to the system that added up, Kodak thought, to non-infringement of Polaroid's very tightly held patents. Polaroid disagreed. The lawsuit began a week later, and it lasted 14 and a half years in court. 1990, the judgment came down. Polaroid was awarded $1 billion from Kodak. It seemed like a fantastic victory, but by that time it was a very different world. It was over, the battle. Kodak had moved on to other things. Polaroid should have moved on to other things by then and had not. Mostly what happened at Polaroid was a fear of the future. Land, as I said, was nudged into retirement in the early 80s, partly because he was stubborn about he didn't want to name a successor, partly because Polavision had suddenly punctured his armor. For 40 years, he had been the man whose crazy vision had driven his company against all logic into continued growth, and he'd made everybody rich. Everything he had tried had worked, and even when it looked improbable, people came along and they said, he's got it, I guess. I'll follow him anywhere. Suddenly, after this, they didn't want to follow him anymore, and his reputation started to crumble. He was nudged into retirement and was replaced by one Polaroid lifer and then another, both of whom were good executives in many ways, but what they did not have was that sense of the future. The thing Polaroid did then and Apple does now and other great companies do like Google is create the thing that you don't know you want yet. Instead, what Polaroid began to do was make what the market research said you wanted. They started doing market research about SX70, and people said, well, up against 35 millimeter pictures, I like that they're a little bigger, that they can be blown up. So they introduced a camera that made slightly bigger pictures, and it did okay for a while. They wanted a more compact camera that you didn't have pictures sort of falling out of it, so they introduced a camera that caught its photos in a little chamber. They said, all right. None of this was world-changing. None of this got into the space beyond, where you saw it and went, I never thought of that, I have to have that. Meanwhile, that was happening in other parts of the industry. The sad part is that Polaroid really knew what the future was going to be. In the early 80s, they had a lab devoted to what was then called electronic filmless photography. They built a big lab in Cambridge with special foundations so they could make things without vibrations. And they were making what are called charge-coupled devices, the sensors in the back of your digital camera. They were making them in a lab setting, ready to go into production in the late 1980s. And what happened at Polaroid was a certain conservatism. When that got to a high enough level in the company for decisions to be made, people said, well, how do we make any money for this? We make money selling film. The cameras are sold more or less at cost. Where's the film in this? I said, well, there is no film. I said, well, we're going to cut into our film business then. There is an apocryphal saying attributed to Lamb, which is this: someone is going to make your product obsolete. Make sure it's you. And Polaroid in the late 1980s could not accept that its product was soon going to be obsolete. And instead, what they started doing was investing in their core product. They doubled down on analog around 1990, which is the worst idea you could have, as it turns out. They chucked another business that they had been about to get into, which was inkjet printing. And yeah, no, they had patents for that too. It was appalling. And instead, they built a new coating plant to make film. They had the sort of loose idea that if they could just get their film costs down a little bit and get the prices down, they would be able to compete with digital, which we now know to be an awful idea because the cost of digital is zero. Bumpity, bumpity, bump, down the hill like that for about 15 years. Even the $1 billion they got from Kodak in 1991, it boosted 1 year's balance sheet. They laudably did some profit sharing and gave a bunch of it away to the employees who worked on it for so long. But ultimately, they could not arrest the slide. Wall Street began to notice, the stock began to fall. And then in the mid-1990s, digital swept in, and you all know what happened there. The film business collapsed very fast, much faster than anyone had predicted. Bankruptcy came in 2001. The company was sold and sold again. And went bankrupt again. The second time, under extraordinary circumstances, really. The latest owner had been a guy named Tom Petters. He had a holding company. He owned a bunch of, mistaken, they owned the Sharper Image and a couple of other distressed brands they bought up to sort of fix them or, sell off their assets or whatever. And he turned out to be running a huge Ponzi scheme. And he needed Polaroid's film income, which was still considerable then, even though much diminished, to pay off the, fake loans he'd made on the other side of the business to move money from one balance sheet to the other. It turned out to be $3 billion he'd stolen. He's in federal prison now for 50 years. And after he was picked up by the feds, Polaroid declared bankruptcy again to get all that off its balance sheet, 2008. And with that bankruptcy, broadly speaking, came the announcement that they were going to quit the film business. They were just going to license their name to make digital cameras and other products, tablets and things like that. Cheap TV sets, similar products. The film plant was wound down. Most of the film was made in Massachusetts, some in Mexico, some in Europe. Those plants were wound down in 2008 and 2009. The Waltham, Massachusetts plant, where much of it came from, is there. I visited in 2010 when it was really a derelict site. I am not the sort of fence jumping sort, but I couldn't stop myself and I went out and took pictures inside. And in fact, all the machinery inside had been scrapped, it was stripped out, it was empty. They had done the same in Mexico. The last plant was in Enschede in the Netherlands. It made all the film for Europe. And it too was to be shut down that year, and its mechanics scrapped. 3 days before it was supposed to be demolished, two guys met at the closing ceremony. One was the plant manager, one was an entrepreneur named Zoe Caps. And they went out for a beer, they were upset about this. And the plant manager knew, well, what Dr. Capps said was, if the machinery weren't destroyed already, we could do something about this. We could pick it up and start making film again. And the plant manager, his name was Andre Dosman, said, I'm the one who's doing the demolition. It starts Monday. And as Capps said, we stopped drinking beer. And over this bar table, they hatched a plan. They made an offer that weekend, and they leased that plant and stopped the demolition of the machine. They incorporated shortly thereafter, and they are the Impossible Project, or were. They've both since left the company. They saved the last chance for film to be made for SX70 and 600 cameras. They had about a year's cushion because they bought some film inventory that they could sell in the meantime. And they spent a year reformulating film, which was much, much more difficult than even their name would have you believe. You know, Polaroid used to order its ingredients by the ton, and these guys were trying to make it on a much smaller scale. You know, it's like one of those artisanal Brooklyn businesses or something. You know, when a company is used to ordering things by the ton and they want, you know, a barrel of it, a chemical company won't make it. One chemical they needed was a grade of titanium dioxide that was made in one factory and one factory only. And a couple of years earlier, that factory, which was located in New Orleans, had been destroyed. They had almost insurmountable odds. Essentially, what they had to do was use these machines to make film that fit in those old cameras, but reinvent the chemistry inside, which was the crazy stuff. They had to come up with an opacifier from scratch, again, because they couldn't make a Polaroid. So there were many, many obstacles. That's why they're called the Impossible Project. The first film came out slightly over a year later, and I hope I'm not saying something impolitic to say it was pretty bad. The first black and white film was unstable, it didn't last. You had to, as it ejected from the camera, you had to dive in front of it and cover it because it wasn't exactly light-proof, it was somewhat light-resistant. Many of us were walking around with this camera with a piece of cardboard taped to the front to block anything that would, you know, hit it. At the same time, it worked. It existed. Although it was a highly imperfect product, call it a beta test or even an alpha test, it was coming along, clearly. The reaction was very mixed at the beginning. People were delighted to have it, and at the same time said, I don't know about this stuff. At the same time, the next batch came along 3 months later. A little more stable, a little better clarity, a little better definition, a little better contrast. First color test came along about 6 months after that, a little washed out, getting there, another batch a few months later. You were watching in real time as this very, very small company recreated Polaroid's development process from 40 years before. In fits and starts with about 10 guys instead of 1,000. The development of Polaroid's SX70 film had in the early 70s cost $1 billion. That's $1 billion early 70s dollars. You'd add a zero to that now. These guys were doing it on a tiny budget with whatever they had at hand and maybe 10 people in this old plant, hoping to make it work. And incredibly, they did. I will say that the current film is pretty good. I shot that just now. I shot that a few months ago. It's my little boy. I have talked a lot here about Lamb and his vision of the world. And one thing I can offer you is I can let him speak for himself. I told you about those shareholders meetings where he'd speak. For the 1970 meeting, rather than just giving a talk, he made a film instead to explain to people what was coming. He stood in the empty factory that was going to make these cameras, and he extemporaneously delivered a sort of talk about his vision of photography for the future. I would say he did it unscripted, and he was not a fantastic performer on camera, so it is somewhat halting. It's also an empty, unfinished factory, so he's got a raincoat on. He comes off a little strangely in this film, but listen to everything he has to say.
Why now? Why a factory of this complexity, automaticity? We have to go back to 1944, to the very first concept of a kind of photography that would become part of the human being, an adjunct to your memory, something that was always with you, so that when you looked at something, you could, in effect, press a button and have a record of it in its accuracy, its intricacy, its beauty, have that forever. Now that kind of camera implied a whole family of technologies which did not exist in 1944. And yet it is clear that as far as we have come, and as remarkable as that achievement seems to be, we are still a long way from the concept, from the realization of the concept of a camera that would be, like the telephone, something that you use all day long, whenever an occasion arises in which you want to make sure that you cannot trust your memory, or when you want to record any object of great interest to you, or any beautiful scene. A camera which you would use not on the occasion of parties only, or of trips only, or when your grandchildren came to see you, but a camera that you would use as often as your pencil or your eyeglasses. They were a long way from the dream which I used to talk about then of being able to take a wallet out of my pocket and perhaps open the wallet, press a button, close the wallet, and have the picture.
It's a camera you'd use on the occasion, not on the occasion of parties or when your grandchildren come to see you, but all the time you would use a telephone. And he says, I used to say back in 1944 that, it would be like a wallet. He reaches into his pocket like this. And he said, you just hold up the wallet, and he takes that black wallet that's about that big, and he holds it up in front of his eyes. You just have the camera, click, and there's your picture. And he drops it back in his pocket. It's the gesture you and I have done every day for the last 5 years. And that is his vision. He didn't live to see it. Edwin Land died in 1991 when the web was 9 weeks old. He didn't live to see it, but you did. And you remember the slogan I told you about before? It's more than a camera, it's almost alive. It is. So there you go. Thank you for coming.
Where's the street sign from?
That is in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where he spent his whole adult life, and where Polaroid was headquartered. It's right on the Charles by the Ware, across from my hotel. Last time I went to Cambridge to research this book, I did not mean to book a hotel on Edwin H. Land Boulevard, but it came up and there it was.
Did you live to see the result of the lawsuit?
Just barely. He never commented on it publicly. He must have been pleased. He had known there had been interim judgments, so they knew they were going to win. They didn't know how much they would get until that last stage. But yeah, he knew, and he must have been pleased. He was in very poor health at the end, so it was a matter of weeks before he died.
Is his family involved at all? His daughter?
No, his daughter is still around. But when he retired from Polaroid, it was not a clean break. It was a very clean break in that sense, but it was also, he was somewhat disappointed to be merged out. And he sold all his stock and he cut all his ties, and he didn't go to their 50th anniversary party a few years later. He sent a letter. He regarded them warmly but distantly, and essentially absented himself from Polaroid in retirement. His family is very private, and they don't comment publicly on much.
How much time does it take you to research and write the book?
How
did you get interested in this topic in the first place?
Well, I got interested in a bunch of ways. I studied the history of science at Hopkins, and there's a lot of history of science in this. I also I read about the arts, so I know a little about photography, a lot more than I used to. And the three things happened at once. One, Polaroid discontinued its film. So there was an endpoint to the story, and then these guys came along and gave it an extra little photo. Second was the bankrupt Polaroid gave its archives to Harvard, and before that they hadn't let anybody in. So you couldn't have written the book a couple of years later. Third, I was thinking about book subjects. I was thinking it was the right time in my career to write a book and was casting about for something. And to be completely blunt, it was 2009, and the magazine business was disintegrating, and I had a feeling I was going to get laid off and needed something to do. So I pitched a book, and then I didn't get laid off, and it almost killed me doing this with a full-time job. So it was about 2.5 years altogether. It's murky at the beginning because you're writing a pitch and you're sending it out and you don't exactly have it deal yet, so you're not exactly researching it. But something like that. There's also a long lag I learned about book publishing. This is my first time through. There's a long lag at the end. You turn it in, you do all your edits, and then it just, nothing happens for 6 months while they're printing. So there's this big wait at the end, and then everything starts up again. Anything else? Yes.
What was he like to work for? Steve Jobs is very famously.
Yeah, one of his employees once said to me, Lam was the kinder genius of the two. However, he was known for his intensity. That is, if he focused on something you were working on, God help you, because he was relentless. He worked 20 hours a day. His old assistant told me that she had a dedicated phone, like the red phone from the White House, in her home that went to his lab. And it would ring anytime, 3:30 in the morning. It would ring. And Lam would be on the other end. This is a story she told me. This actually happened. And he would say something. She'd pick up the phone and say hello. There'd be a pause, and he'd say, tell me something interesting. And she would. And then there would be 2 minutes of silence. And then the conversation would start to gather. It's strange, right? The other thing is that you'd get calls at 3:30 in the morning, and he would say something like, I had an idea, could you come in and discuss it at 5 for breakfast? And they would go. They all say that he drove them to levels of creativity and invention that they did not believe they had within themselves, which is a genius kind of management, but only appeals to a certain kind of person, obviously. Some people feel invigorated by an environment like that. Some people say, have you lost your mind calling me at 3:30 in the morning? And you had to be the right kind of person. The right kind of person stayed for 40 years. Over and over and over when researching this, I met old Polaroid employees who had said it was like nothing else. There was no other place I ever wanted to work. This was the best place in the world to work as a scientist. The other thing that's striking is that he liked, unusually among scientists of his generation, he liked women. And he worked well with women. And in fact, he made a point of hiring them. This is very unusual. What Lam would do, starting in the late 30s, he had a good friend who was a professor at Smith, an art history professor at Smith. And he, every year, would get recommendations from the best student from that professor's class. And he hired all these young women. Now, they were art history majors, a lot of them. He needed chemists. So he would send them off to MIT for a little night school or something, and they would come back chemists who were also literate when it came to color and light and things that photography incorporates. He also was an aesthete, and he wanted people who could keep up when he was talking about Rembrandt, as well as photography, photochemistry. So he created his own Renaissance woman chemists. There was this little sort of core of them within the company. The old timers in the company all called them the princesses because they had the beard. And one of them in particular, Maureen Morse was her name. She was a fantastic character. She played the harp. She had an apartment with an array of harps in the bay window. And she was a fantastic chemist. She essentially invented Polaroid black and white film. And she died very young. Otherwise, the company may have gone in a very different direction before it was a remarkable place to be. And there still are many places like it. Especially now. Back then companies could spend a lot on research and development. As I said, $1 billion on a film development project, and another $1 billion on the camera over, call it 10 years. It's a huge amount of money. If you're answering to stockholders who want a big return every quarter, you can't do that anymore.
Maybe one more question?
Okay? Maybe we're done.
I have one more question.
Sure.
What was the thing that surprised you the most when you were writing the book? That was unexpected.
There are many. I think, how thoroughly the company was built around Edwin Land's brain as its chief asset. You know, he was really treated like a unique creature, and how thoroughly special he was in his time. You know, people knew he was not like other CEOs. He was not like other inventors. And the only reason I think he has fallen out of the public sphere, if his company had not declined and disintegrated the way it did, I honestly think Edwin Land would now be talked about in the same breath with not only Steve Jobs, but Edison and Westinghouse and George Eastman and the other great American inventor entrepreneurs. And I think it's because they screwed up his company so badly after he left that he had really fallen away. The other reason is that he did not court publicity. Although he got a great deal of it, magazine covers and so forth, he didn't actually enjoy it, and he kept a lid on how much of it. He disliked the imprecision of journalism. He would have hated this book because they fought back many people who wanted to write it during his lifetime. There is a biography of him, but it was only published after his death. He sort of half cooperated. It was published after he died. He didn't like the publicity game, and in fact, at his death, he had all his papers shredded. He said, "I want my scientific work to stand for me and not public relations," and that I think has caused him to somewhat disappear. I mean, there are people in the know, like these folks here, understand that he was an extraordinary figure, and there are comments to him. But he's not really well known anymore in a way that he was 40 or 50 years ago.
So, like, to back off of that, we talked about Thomas Edison and Frank and all these people who we've immortalized as inventors, and now to me of his big role in that. So, do you have any thoughts on what it would take to be a celebrity inventor, scientist?
Well, the model is Jobs, needless to say.
Yeah.
The answer is twofold. It's, as I said before, invent something that people don't know they want. You know, he did no market research. For one product once, they did a little market research on what color it should be. But other than that, they not only disdained it, but they rejected it. They absolutely didn't do it. And, you know, he once said, marketing is what you do when your product isn't very good. And in fact, Steve Jobs, 40 years later, was once asked what kind of market research he had done for the, I think it was the iPhone, the iPod when it was introduced, I think. And he said, no, it's not the consumer's job to know what they want. I mean, it's almost the same thing. Invention is a case of envisioning what doesn't exist yet, rather than what exists and needs improvement. You look for a hole in someone's life, and something that solves it for us. It's not much of an answer because I don't know how to do that. But a few people do, and he is one of them.
Thank you, Chris.
Fascinating. One of the things that I just said to Righty is I'm so bummed that we didn't have the volume for you to hear. But what we'll do is send you a link to the clip so that you can actually, it's very, very powerful, so you can actually hear for yourself. Perfect ending. So Chris, thank you so much for being here. I also want to take a minute and say thank you to the Impossible Project Space for letting us come in and teach this afternoon. Thank you very much. I mean, it's like the perfect place to have this, which was also Chris's fabulous idea. My name is Elena Thompson, and I'm the Senior Associate Director of Affinity Engagement, which is really a fancy way of saying really community, Hopkins communities, based around common interests or backgrounds or passions. I've been working in this role a couple of years with my colleague, Righty Anderson, my partner in crime. And we've tried to build these different communities around our alumni's interests, and it really corresponds as well with our students and our parents and our friends at Hopkins. They've all kind of come into the fold.
You didn't come here expecting that to take
And so we've tried to build the groups. They've gone from about 3 to almost 19 at this point over the last 2 years. We've got some postcards here. We have a bunch of active groups, this Arts, Entertainment, Media, and Entrepreneurship Affinity group, which are our hosts and the designers, F. Epstein in particular, for this evening's event, one of the most active here in New York, but there are a bunch of others. And we've got a bunch of committee members here as well. So I wondered if you guys, they've got little badges on, but will you guys stand up so the other people know who you are? Please don't be shy. So we are always looking for interesting ideas, looking for individuals to get involved. The idea for these affinity groups and communities is really about literally building community, trying to make connections where there might not be any. You know, we've got the great ability to connect because you all live in New York, but maybe that's not enough, or you all graduated a particular year, but we're really trying to zero in and take the randomness out of the connections that you might have with other Hopkins community members that you might not know you need to know. And so that's really the business of this group. I want to thank you all very much for being here.